Season 0, Episode 2, The Man the Hanbalites Tried to Silence. In the last episode, we established what this channel is built on. The proposition that Islamic history is not a collection of dates and dynasties, but a living argument about God, power, and the nature of time itself. We asked who the first builders of that argument were, and we said the answer begins with a man born in a provincial city on the edge of the Caspian Sea in the winter of 839, who would spend the next 86 years constructing the most comprehensive record of human civilization that the medieval world had ever seen. Today we meet him, and if you're new here, this channel has been building something. Every episode connects. Hit subscribe so you are here for the next one. This history is only getting bigger from here. Now, Baghdad. The year is 310 of the Hijrah. It is February, and the cold comes off the Tigris in long, flat sheets. On a street in the Al-Shamasiyah district, in a house near the Baradan Bridge, a man is dying. He is 86 years old, and he is thin. He was always thin, one of those men whose body never accumulated anything it did not need. His hair and beard are still mostly dark, which had astonished people for decades. He has been ill for the last several years, a recurring inflammation in his chest that the physicians called pleurisy, and that he treated himself, to the grudging admiration of the Christian doctor the vizier once sent to examine him. Outside the house, something extraordinary is happening. The streets are full of stones. Not thrown, not yet, piled. The followers of a particular faction of scholars have been gathering outside his door for days, making their displeasure known in the language of the street. They have accused this dying man of heresy. They have called him a Shiite extremist, a secret enemy of the Orthodox faith, a Jamite, which, in the theological vocabulary of the day, was about the worst thing you could call someone. They have driven students away from his lectures. They have thrown rocks at his house. And now, as he lies on his deathbed asking for water so he can perform the ablution for the noon prayer, because even dying, he will not combine prayers, will not take a shortcut, will not compromise. They are outside. The man inside is Abu Ja'far, Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari. He is the greatest historian the Islamic world has ever produced. He is the author of the most exhaustive commentary on the Quran written in the classical period. He is a jurist who founded his own legal school. He has written, by conservative estimate, 14 folios every single day for the better part of his adult life. And in a few hours, when his spirit leaves his body and the people who loved him wash him and prepare him for burial, they will do it quietly, in the early morning, in the courtyard of his own house, because the mob outside has made a public funeral too dangerous to attempt. The question this episode is going to answer is, how does the greatest scholar of his age end up buried like a fugitive? The answer reaches back more than 70 years, to a city no one had heard of, on the edge of a sea the Arabs called the Caspian, in a province called Tabaristan. Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari was born in Amul, the principal capital of Tabaristan, located in the lowlands roughly 20 kilometers from the southern shore of the Caspian Sea. The year was somewhere in the winter of 839, when al-Mutasim sat on the caliphal throne in Baghdad. Tabari himself was uncertain whether he arrived at the end of the Hijra year 224 or the beginning of 225. He knew only that something noteworthy had happened in Amul at the time of his birth, but when he asked the elders about it in later life, they could not agree on what it was. The region he was born into was not peaceful. In the years 224 and 225, the governor of Tabaristan, a man named Mazyar ibn Qarin, a recent convert to Islam from a family that was still largely non-Muslim, had rebelled against the Tahirid dynasty that administered the province on behalf of the caliphate. The rebellion brought heavy taxation to the landowners of Amul and left the city itself laid waste. Whether this political turbulence touched Tabari's family directly, we do not know. What we know is that the family survived it, that Amul recovered, and that the boy born into that moment of provincial disorder would spend the next 8 decades trying to make sense of the order underneath all human disorder. His father Jarir was not a wealthy man, but he was a man of property. He owned agricultural land in Tabaristan, farms and estates whose proceeds came to him in the form of merchandise rather than coin, carried to Baghdad each year by the pilgrim caravan. He was not a scholar himself, almost certainly, but he was the kind of provincial father who understood that the world was large, and that his son had a mind that needed more room than Amul could provide, and the mind was extraordinary from the beginning. Tabari himself, as an old man, probably in his 70s, trying to convince the father of a 9-year-old boy that the child was not too young to begin serious study, looked back and reported what he could remember of his own early years. He had memorized the Quran by the age of 7. He led the communal prayer at 8. He began writing down the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ at 9. He was not boasting. He was making a practical argument, but the memory reveals something about the kind of child he was, one in whom learning was not a discipline imposed from outside, but a hunger that operated continuously, like breathing. His father had a dream about the boy. In it, he saw his son standing before the Prophet Muhammad, holding a bag full of stones, scattering them at the Prophet's feet. A dream interpreter told him the vision meant the child would grow to be a strong defender of the religious law. Whether this was a real dream or a story shaped by time and the reverence of students, its function in the biographical tradition is clear. It marks Tabari as a man whose destiny was announced before he was old enough to understand it. When he was 12 years old, the year 236 of the Hijrah, his father sent him away to learn. In the Islamic world of the 9th century, the phrase traveling in quest of knowledge meant something precise and demanding. It meant leaving home, often for years, often for the better part of a lifetime, to sit at the feet of the scholars who held the chains of transmission through which knowledge was authorized and passed forward. It was not tourism. It was pilgrimage, but the shrine was a person, and the relic was a verified chain of names stretching back to the Prophet or his companions. The boy from Amul would spend the next 2 decades walking those chains. His first stop was al-Rayy, on the site of what is now Tehran, where he spent close to 5 years under the teachers who would form the intellectual skeleton of everything he later built. The most important of them was Ibn Humayd, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Humayd al-Razi, a man then in his 70s, a veteran scholar who had lectured in Baghdad and been welcomed by Ibn Hanbal himself. Ibn Humayd was one of Tabari's most frequently cited authorities in everything he ever wrote. Through him, through a transmission chain that ran Ibn Humayd, Salama ibn al-Fadl, Ibn Ishaq, Tabari received access to the great historian of the Prophet's life, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, the man who had done for the Sirah what Tabari would later do for the whole of human history. This is not a small thing. It means that Tabari's connection to the historical record of early Islam was not abstract or mediated through texts alone. It ran through living men who had sat in rooms with the transmitters, who sat in rooms with the transmitters who had been there. In the epistemology of classical Islamic scholarship, this chain was not a footnote. It was the whole argument for why something could be known. At al-Rayy, he also learned what it meant to work. His teacher Ibn Humayd was demanding. Students who wanted access to a scholar in that world did not simply walk in and sit down. They had to prove themselves, often publicly, on the spot. The biographical tradition preserves a story about Tabari arriving at another teacher's house, Abu Kurayb, in al-Kufah years later, where the scholar looked out from a window and asked the assembled students which of them could recite from memory the traditions he had dictated to them the previous day. The other students looked at each other and pointed to Tabari. Abu Kurayb examined him and found him able to recite every tradition he had been taught, with the exact day on which it had been taught. The scholar admitted him. This was the competitive environment in which Tabari was educated, one where memory, precision, and the ability to perform under pressure were not incidental virtues, but the basic admission requirements. From al-Rayy, he went to Baghdad, arriving, as the sources tell it, shortly after the death of Ahmad ibn Hanbal in 855, which was a fact he would have reason to remember for the rest of his life, though not in the way his enemies would later claim. Then south, to al-Basra and al-Kufah and the great scholars of the southern cities, men already in their 70s and 80s, holding the last living threads of transmission from the earliest period of Islam. He sat with Ibn Bashar, known as Bundar, in al-Basra. He sat with Abu Kurayb in al-Kufah. He collected their teachings into notebooks and checked those notebooks against the written sources their teachings rested on, building a library that was both oral and textual at once, because he understood, with unusual clarity for his time, that the two were not the same thing, and that one checked the other. Then west, Syria, Palestine, Egypt. In Beirut, he sat with al-Abbas ibn al-Walid ibn Mazyar al-Udri, who transmitted to him the variant readings of the Quran according to the Syrian school, and, through his father, the legal opinions of al-Awza'i, the great Syrian jurist who had been dead for nearly a century, but whose thinking still shaped how law was reasoned in the Levant. In Egypt, he sat with Yunus ibn Abd al-Ala, the leading scholar of hadith and Quranic reading in the country. He sat with al-Rabi' ibn Sulaiman, the muezzin of the Mosque of Amr, who had been personally connected to al-Shafi'i, and who made his home available to Tabari and gave him access to the Shafi'i tradition at its source. He sat with the Ibn Abd al-Hakam family, one of the most consequential families in Egyptian intellectual life, intimately connected to al-Shafi'i and simultaneously expert in the legal school of Malik, and through them received a training in comparative jurisprudence that no single region of the Islamic world could have provided. He was in Egypt when, according to one account, something happened that illuminates both who he was and who he was not yet. 4 scholars were in Egypt at the same time, all named Muhammad, as the sources delightfully record, and they ran out of money. The 4 were Tabari, Muhammad ibn Nasr al-Marwazi, who was 20 years older than the rest and already an established jurist, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Harun al-Ruyani, and Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn Khuzaymah al-Nisaburi, who had studied with many of the same teachers as Tabari and would become one of his most loyal defenders in later years. They cast lots to determine who would go out and beg for food. The lot fell to Ibn Khuzaymah. Before he could leave, a messenger arrived from the governor of Al-Fustat with 50 dinars for each of them. The governor had dreamed of hungry scholars and wanted to alleviate their condition. The story is probably embellished. The sum is suspiciously large, and the timing is suspiciously perfect, and the tradition of 4 Muhammad stories suggests a recurring motif rather than a singular event. But its kernel is almost certainly true. Tabari and Ibn Khuzaymah knew each other in Egypt. They were young scholars of similar formation and similar ambition, and the friendship between them, or at least the mutual respect, would endure for the rest of their lives. When Ibn Khuzaymah eventually read Tabari's Quranic Commentary in full, he sent back word, "I know of nobody upon the face of the earth who is more learned than Muhammad ibn Jarir. He has been wronged by the Hanbalites." He said this before the worst of it happened. Let that phrase sit for a moment. Wronged by the Hanbalites. To understand what it means, you have to understand what the Hanbalites were in Tabari's Baghdad and what they were afraid of. Ahmad ibn Hanbal had died in 855, the year Tabari arrived in the capital. He had been the most consequential religious figure of the previous generation, a man who had endured imprisonment and flogging under the Mutazilite Inquisition rather than affirm the createdness of the Quran, who had emerged from that ordeal as a symbol of orthodox resistance to speculative theology, and whose legal and theological positions had become, for his followers, not just a school of thought but a badge of identity, a declaration of what true Sunni Islam was and was not. The Hanbalite movement in Tabari's time was the latest of the major legal schools and was still fighting for its place. It had in its ranks men of extraordinary dedication and, in some cases, extraordinary willingness to use social and physical pressure to achieve religious and political goals. Al-Barbahari, who would become one of the movement's most aggressive voices, would later make it a practice to announce at every gathering he attended that God would seat Muhammad with himself on the divine throne, using the interpretation of a Quranic phrase as a loyalty test, a shibboleth, a way of fleshing out the insufficiently orthodox. Tabari was insufficiently orthodox by their measure, not because he was secretly a Shiite or a Mu'tazilite or any of the other things they accused him of being, but because he was something they found equally threatening, a scholar who reserved the right to think for himself. He had spent decades studying every major school of Islamic law, Malikite, Shafi'ite, Hanafite, Awza'ite, and when he eventually founded his own school of jurisprudence, the Jariri Madhab, it was precisely because he had concluded that the evidence did not always point where any single school said it pointed. He was what the classical sources call an al-ijtihad, a practitioner of independent legal reasoning. He believed, with the confidence of a man who had read everything, that the primary sources, read carefully and honestly, did not always produce the consensus that the established schools claimed they produced. This was dangerous, not because it was wrong. By the standards of classical Islamic jurisprudence, his method was entirely legitimate, but because it made him a rival. And the Hanbalites in particular had built their identity around the idea that the right answer was already known, that Ahmad ibn Hanbal had established it, and that anyone who applied independent reasoning to reach a different conclusion was not merely mistaken but corrupt. There was also a specific theological trigger point. In his great Quranic Commentary, Tabari engaged with the interpretation of a phrase from Surah 17, verse 79, the praiseworthy position promised to the Prophet Muhammad. Most scholars understood this as a reference to Muhammad's role as intercessor on the day of resurrection, but there was a tradition attributed to the early Quranic commentator Mujahid, transmitted through a chain that ran through one of the Hanbalites' favorite authorities, which stated that the praiseworthy position meant that God would seat Muhammad on his divine throne. The Hanbalites had adopted this interpretation as a rallying cry. Anyone who questioned it was, in their framework, denying a special distinction to the Prophet, and therefore a heretic. Tabari, with his usual measured precision, did not simply reject the Mujahid tradition. He analyzed it. He engaged with it using the tools of speculative theology, the very tools the Hanbalites considered suspect, and concluded that while the intercession interpretation was better supported, the throne interpretation could not be definitively ruled out. He was trying to be honest. He was trying to do what a careful scholar does, follow the evidence where it leads, and acknowledge the limits of what the evidence can establish. The Hanbalites experienced this as an attack. When word spread that he had called the throne tradition absurd, and that he had composed a verse mocking it, a ditty that circulated through the streets and was later found written on the wall of his house, the situation turned violent. Hanbalite followers stoned his residence. He was confined, in effect, to his home. Students who came from out of town to study with him were told by Hanbalite enforcers that attending his lectures was dangerous, not for the student's body necessarily, but for their reputation, their career, their standing in the community of Orthodox scholars. Ibn Khuzaymah, in Nisabur, told a student who returned from Baghdad without having studied with Tabari that he had made a catastrophic error. You would have profited more from attending a single lecture of Tabari than from all your study with the other teachers in Baghdad. But the boycott was real. The intimidation was real. And Tabari, who was by all accounts a man of extraordinary personal courage, who had once returned to Tabaristan and spoken publicly in defense of the first two caliphs against Shiite pressure, and barely escaped the region with his life, who refused the wazir's gifts, refused the judgeship, refused every offer of official position that would have compromised his independence. This man, in the last years of his life, could not safely leave his house. Here is where the history invites us to pause and apply the lens of civilization. What was actually happening in those streets of Baghdad in the early 10th century was not simply a theological dispute about where the prophet would sit on the last day. That was the language of the conflict, but the conflict itself was about something much larger. Who gets to decide what Islam means, and by what method? Tabari's position, unstated but absolutely clear in everything he wrote and taught, was that the answer to any question in Islamic law or theology had to be worked out by trained scholars using rigorous methods of textual analysis, logical reasoning, and honest engagement with the limits of human knowledge. No single school had a monopoly on truth. No single tradition, however prestigious its chain of transmission, was automatically immune to scrutiny. The primary sources, the Quran and the authenticated traditions of the Prophet, were available to anyone who had the training to read them properly, and anyone who had that training had the right and the obligation to follow the evidence wherever it led. The Hanbalites' position, also unstated, also absolutely clear, was that this kind of independent reasoning was precisely the problem. Ibn Hanbal had suffered for the correct answer. The community had rallied around him. The correct answer was therefore known. What remained was not more thinking, but more obedience. A scholar who kept thinking past the point where the community had settled was not displaying intellectual virtue. He was displaying intellectual pride, which was a spiritual failing, and a dangerous one. These two positions were not just theological abstractions. They were competing claims about the structure of authority in a civilization. And they remain competing claims today, in every tradition, in every institution, in every community that has to decide whether its future lies in the direction of inquiry or the direction of settlement. Tabari voted for inquiry. He voted for it with the work of his entire life. He paid for it with his freedom in the years he should have been able to spend in peace. Let us go now to the room where it begins. Not the room where he dies, but the room where he first understands what his life is going to cost him. The year is somewhere around 290 of the Hijrah. Al-Tabari has just returned from a second visit to Tabaristan, his homeland, the place where he was born, the place that carries his name. He went back to defend the honor of the first two caliphs against Shiite pressure. He spoke publicly. An old man who warned him of the danger awaiting him was beaten by the local authorities. Tabari himself had to leave Tabaristan in a hurry, quickly enough that the man who had warned him ended up being brought to Baghdad as Tabari's guest, to be cared for in the historian's home. He is back in a Shamsiyya. He is in his early 50s, which, in the 9th century, is already old age for many men, though not for him. 3 Hanbalites come to him. The sources name them Abu Abdullah al-Jassas, Ja'far ibn Arafah, and al-Bayadi. They want to know his views on the Mujahid tradition, the one about the Prophet ﷺ being seated on the divine throne. Tabari tells them what he thinks. He is not diplomatic about it. He calls the tradition absurd. And then, this is the part that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He composes a verse, a small poem, a jingle, really, the kind of thing a man says when he is too tired of being careful. Praised be the one who has no confidant, and has no one to sit on his throne. The Hanbalites leave. Within hours, the stoning begins. What happens next is a portrait of a man who has spent his life learning to be precise about what can be known and what cannot, and who now faces a force that has no interest in precision. The mob does not want to debate him. The mob wants him silent. And silence is the one thing Tabari genuinely cannot produce, because silence would mean that the life of work he has built, the hundreds of thousands of folios, the chains of transmission, the decades of sitting in rooms with old men and writing down what they knew, all of it would be surrendered to the claim that one school, one tradition, one set of enforcers had the right to define what Islam was and was not. He does not recant. He does not leave Baghdad. He does not seek a position in the government that might have offered him protection. The wazir offers him a judgeship. He declines. He offers another appointment. He declines again. He is offered a third position, and he declines that too. And when his friends urge him to accept, telling him that the post needs the prestige of a renowned jurist, he rebukes them sharply. They are the last people, he says, who should be encouraging him to compromise. They know better than anyone what he is there to do. What he is there to do is right. The output of his life is almost impossible to comprehend as the product of a single human being. His students calculated that if you took the total number of folios he had produced and divided by the number of days from his puberty to his death, you arrived at 14 folios per day, every single day. The grammarian Ali ibn Ubaidullah al-Samsimi, who told his student al-Khatib al-Baghdadi about Tabari's work habits, said the number was 40 folios a day for 40 years. These figures contradict each other, and both are probably exaggerated, and neither matters. What matters is that the people who knew him and studied with him and watched him work felt that the output required a number from outside the normal range of human capability. The great Quranic Commentary, the Jami al-Bayan, the complete clarification, ran to 10,000 folios in some manuscript traditions. The history, the Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, the history of prophets and kings, is what we would today call a universal history. It begins with the creation of the world, with the nature of time itself, with the question of what existed before God created night and day. And it runs, event by documented event, year by year, through the history of pre-Islamic civilizations, through the life of the Prophet, through the Rashidun Caliphate, through the Umayyads, through the Abbasids, to the year 915. It is the single most important source for the history of the early Islamic period that exists. When modern historians want to know what happened at the Battle of Qadisiyah, or in the corridors of the Caliphal court during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, or in the councils that preceded the First Civil War of Islam, they go to Tabari, not as one source among many, as the source that all other sources are measured against. He worked on this history the way a general plans a campaign, systematically from the foundations up, never losing sight of the whole while managing the details of each engagement. And like the best generals, he was honest about the limits of his intelligence. The methodological statement he placed at the very beginning of the history is one of the most important things ever written about how a historian should understand his own work. He writes, and this is the principle that governs every page that follows, that with respect to all he has set down in this book, he relies upon traditions and reports as transmitted and attributed to their transmitters. He relies only very exceptionally on what is learned through rational argument and internal thought processes, because no knowledge of the history of men of the past can be attained by those who were not present to observe them and did not live in their time, except through information and transmission provided by informants and transmitters. This knowledge cannot be produced by reason alone. And then he adds the sentence that distinguishes him from every lesser historian. If a reader finds in this book something that he disapproves of or finds detestable, he should know that it is not our fault. We have merely reported it as it was reported to us. This is not an evasion. It is a principle of intellectual honesty so demanding that most institutions, academic, religious, political, have never managed to consistently apply it. He is saying, I am a transmitter. My job is to pass forward what the sources preserve, not to pre-filter it through my conclusions. The reader's job is to evaluate. My job is to make the evaluation possible by giving the reader access to everything, not just the things that confirm what I want to believe. The mob outside his house, in the year 310 of the Hijra, was afraid of exactly this. They were afraid of a man who would not pre-filter. He is dying now. We are back in Shamsiyah, in the cold of February. His student Ibn Kamil is there, the man who had studied with him for years, who would go on to write a biography of him, who was present at the end and recorded what he saw. Ibn Kamil asks him for advice, for something that could guide those who loved him after he was gone. Tabari tells him, follow my religious practice. Act in accordance with what I have explained in my books. Then he repeats the confession of faith. He mentions God's name many times. He wipes his face with his hand. He uses it to close his eyes. And when he lets go, his spirit has left his body. He is buried the following morning, not in the public cemetery, not with a procession that a scholar of his standing would normally receive. In the courtyard of his own house, in the early hours before the city is fully awake, while the stones from the previous night's demonstrations still lie in the street outside. It is, by any honest measure, a kind of defeat. The mob did not silence him during his life, but they managed to steal his funeral. Except, here is what history knows that the mob did not. They did not steal the work. The history survived. The commentary survived. The legal writings survived, or enough of them to tell us what he built. The Fatimid Caliph al-Aziz in Egypt paid 100 dinars for a single copy of the history, and then discovered that his library already contained more than 20 copies, including one written in Tabari's own hand. By the time Saladin entered Cairo in 1171, the Fatimid palace held over 1,200 copies of the history. 1,200. In a world before the printing press, that is not a number. That is a verdict. Ibn Khuzaymah had been right. The man the Hanbalites tried to silence spent the next 1,000 years being impossible to silence. Here is the question this episode leaves open, and I want your answer in the comments. Tabari refused every offer of government protection. The judgeship, the court appointments, the official positions that would have given him security. He chose intellectual independence over physical safety and paid for it with his final years. Was that the right call? Could he have accomplished more from inside the system? Or does the work only mean what it means because he stood entirely outside it? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment to do it. What happens next? What Tabari actually wrote about creation, time, and the beginning of everything is the reason this channel exists. Hit subscribe so you do not miss it. Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari died on Monday, the 27th of Shawwal, in the year 310 of the Hijra, the 17th of February, 923 of the Common Era. He was 86 years old. He had never married. He had no children that anyone could verify. He had spent more than 70 years in the pursuit of a single question. What can human beings actually know about the past, and how do we know it? The answer he built runs to tens of thousands of pages and forms the foundation of everything subsequent Islamic historiography attempted. In the next episode, we step inside the history itself. We open the first pages of what Tabari wrote, and we ask the question he asked before he wrote a single event. What is time? How long has it existed? What was there before it? And why does a historian begin there, at the very edge of what human knowledge can reach, before he says a single word about a single human being? The answer is not what you expect. It never is with this man. If you missed last episode, the one that established why this channel exists and why this history matters, it is linked on your screen and in the description. Start there if you are new. The foundation matters. Subscribe if you have not. Share this episode if it gave you something. One share puts this history in front of someone who has never heard it told this way. This is the House of Wisdom, where history is never just the past.